Okay, so welcome everyone. It is officially the second installment of the EndoSocial series. My name is Dr. Alexandra Rokriti. I'm a medical humanities specialist, and the goal of this series is to highlight non-medical endometriosis research. So, research in the social sciences and the humanities regarding endometriosis. And I am super thrilled to have Dr. Eileen Holowka here today. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. I forgot to ask you.
Yeah, it's good. It's good.
So thank you for joining us, Eileen. And I have to congratulate Eileen, who has done a lot of work, but most famously, if I can use that word, published a study or a paper called Mediating Pain, Navigating Endometriosis on Social Media. And that is the study that has also inspired me to invite her here. It is a very well cited study, and I've also referred to it a lot in my own dissertation. So, congratulations on this work.
Thank you so much.
And before we dive into your presentation, I'm just wondering, I like to do, a little bit of small talk before, also to let people introduce themselves, because I'm not a very big fan of just reading out somebody's bio. No one listens to that anyway. If you could tell us a little bit about your research interest in general, and I'm also curious how it came to be that you decided to research endometriosis on social media. What sparked your interest?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was doing sort of research that was in media studies. I've always been interested in social media as a topic of research, and like newer technology as well. And when I started my PhD, I was thinking of doing, I don't know, something about social media and video games or something like that. But I had been living with endometriosis for I don't know how long, like 10 years or something at that point, and had experienced what a lot of people experience with dismissal and misdiagnoses. Um, and I actually only first heard the word endometriosis when I Googled my own symptoms. And despite going to so many different doctors and practitioners and describing like the most obvious endometriosis symptoms, that never came from a doctor, it came from Google. Um, and I thought that that was something that probably a lot of other people had experienced. And I started to become involved in social media and endometriosis, and like interested in these spaces. And I dipped my toe into that, and I can talk about that more as we go. But once I sort of saw that situation, I was like, oh, this is what I want to focus on.
And just out of curiosity, this might be something that you'll address in your presentation as well, but you've told a story which is unfortunately very stereotypical. And it is sad that it is the usual story. We're actually surprised when somebody doesn't say that it took them ages to get a diagnosis or that they found out that they were dismissed and they found out exactly what endometriosis was from somebody other than their doctor, or at least other than the first doctor that they've spoken to. And this is a big question, but just from off the top of your head, what would you say is one of the main reasons for this? Why does this happen?
Yeah, I think a major reason is medical misogyny. Like, we know that conditions that predominantly affect people assigned female at birth are dismissed more. Like, we know that the research is often based on white cis men. So, one great example of this that's like outside of endometriosis is heart attacks. The symptoms of heart attacks that we recognize as being symptoms of heart attacks are based on men, and this often means that women are not treated as well. They don't think to go to the ER. They are like mistreated at the ER. So we have a real medical misogyny problem. And I'll talk more in the presentation about like bias and shame and how that has impacted things, and this like history of the dismissal of women's pain, and the pain in general, chronic conditions in general, are don't really fit into the medical Western medical model because it's focused on cure, and chronic conditions aren't necessarily something you can just simply cure. So that's another aspect.
Exactly. Now, I wanted to have a couple of follow-up questions about whether you see this reflected in digital data, but I feel that I'll be butting into your presentation a lot. This was just to get our juices flowing a little bit. So I will now hand you over the space if you want to share your screen. And for everyone that just joined us a little bit later, I just want to repeat what I said in the beginning. Um, because I see that we've had, sorry, I'm not a great multitasker. Because I see that we've had a couple of people join us a bit later, so I will just repeat this while you get set up. So we are recording this. It will be posted to YouTube. I will also announce when we've stopped recording. So for this time, it's I just want you all to be aware of that, and it's up to you how much you want to reveal. If you want your real names to be out there, or if you want to turn your cameras on or off. I would just ask you all to keep your microphones turned off at this time. And while Eileen is presenting, I would ask you to use the chat. If you have comments, notes, any questions, then at the end, we will first address those questions. And if we still have time, then we will open the floor for a little bit of a Q&A where you're free to turn on your cameras as well. Okay, so without further ado, Eileen, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this. This title here was the title of my dissertation, which I realized I forgot the other day because it's been a while since I wrote it. Um, I've tried to shorten this down to 10 minutes, so if there's any like areas that feel like they need more elaboration or you want more information on, you want to talk about more, just let me know and we can get into it. I'm happy to chat about any of these things. Um, just really quickly, I mean, you already know I'm Eileen. I live on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg in Canada, and I have a PhD from Concordia University in Montreal in Canada where I did this research. Um, and I left academia after finishing my PhD over 2 years ago, over three. I don't know. It's been a minute. And I currently work in video games, but these topics are still really close to my heart. I've been writing about them still in other forms, essays and creative writing. So I'm just excited to talk about this stuff forever. Um, and I've sort of described how I came to this research already in the introduction. Um, as I started to dip my toes into social media around endometriosis, I realized that this can be a really powerful tool for those of us who are chronically ill, because we aren't always able to leave the house to connect with people in other ways. And while people with endometriosis have been trying to connect with each other throughout history via letter writing and newsletters, social media has really changed the game over the last 10 to 15 years. What I noticed when I started my PhD was that most of the research on endometriosis and social media focuses on online misinformation and the dangers of social media, which is an important topic and something that we do need to keep researching. But it's not the only topic and it's not the only thing at play. While online misinformation is always a risk, there is also very important informational, social, and activist work that happens on social media that shouldn't be so easily dismissed. And what I found out in my dissertation research was that patients are more likely to go to social media when they've already experienced dismissal by doctors. And yet, if they bring up social media use in a doctor's appointment, that can actually lead to further dismissal. So it's this catch-22 situation. And this had me asking the question, has the dismissal of social media itself become a new form of patient blaming? And is social media use the new cop-out to not treat our disease? to blame the symptoms on ourselves. So let's talk super briefly about the history of patient blaming in endometriosis, which I can elaborate on more later. We can tie endometriosis into historical depictions of the hysterical woman and the wandering womb. There's some great articles about this. Uh, and then we see this evolve in the 20th century, particularly 1948 to 1990, when endometriosis begins to be characterized in medical textbooks as a career woman's disease that occurs when predominantly white women choose to wait to have children. So sort of this like imperfect femininity. And this later evolved in the 1990s into the belief that endometriosis was caused by chronic exposure to environmental toxins, and that these exposures could be passed on to children by negligent mothers who don't take the correct precautions. So notice a trend with all of these examples. The responsibility for the illness and its improvement is placed on the patient. And this, of course, is common in feminized conditions, because if you don't get better, you become a drain on the capitalistic system that Western healthcare depends upon, which I talked about a bit before. My argument is that we further see stigma and blame playing out today in the ways that doctors blame people with endometriosis for going online and reading misinformation as the reason why their treatments aren't working or why they aren't getting better. And we've seen this recently. It's a lot of research that focuses on pain science and social media and sort of quantifying the tone of these spaces, talking about like the negative impacts of these spaces and how those negative impacts can then cause more pain, which can be valid. But again, I don't think that's the full picture, and it does drift into patient blaming at times. What the sort of these articles on online misinformation don't account for is that social media involves something that is commonly missing from clinical encounters, and that's online peer-to-peer information exchange and connection. This online rapport is crucial to obtain the knowledge, the acknowledgement and validation that is missing in other aspects of patients' lives, where the condition is often dismissed, minimized, or ignored altogether. Because of the isolation and stigmatization commonly experienced by those living with endometriosis, contact with other patients is highly valued, and social media is often one of the easiest or only ways to find these kinds of connections. I always come back to this post by the Endo Monologues where she writes, "Female hysteria? Why, yes, being misdiagnosed time after time does make me hysterical." Her post redirects hysteria back towards the medical system itself. The act of being dismissed as hysterical is itself the cause of the so-called hysteria of having a normal emotional response to mistreatment. So my main conclusion from my research was that we cannot blame people with endometriosis for using fraught social media spaces when the nature of endometriosis research and care itself is full of conflict and division. We cannot keep blaming patients for these systemic failures. In fact, I believe that there is no endometriosis future without patients at the center of the conversation. And these social media networks show us that patients are always going to find a way to connect and share information. All it takes is logging onto social media to see just how much is being said about endometriosis. And I argue that we need to tune in and learn from it, because a lot of this work is research work, is advocacy work, and is educational. There are a wide range of things when we go online and look up endometriosis, and it's a lot for patients to weed through themselves. For my research, I focused less on analyzing everything that was out there and instead directly asked people with endometriosis who use social media what they use it for, why they're there. I specifically steered away from scraping data because informed consent in my research was really important to me, particularly because so often in endometriosis care, people don't get informed consent. And I think there's a lot of issues with just scraping data and then analyzing it from an outside perspective. I surveyed 287 people living with the disease about their experiences with endometriosis in social media, as well as spoke one-on-one with 22 patients and one doctor. And this image is really tiny and grainy, but based on what people said they use social media for, I broke these sections down into four main categories. Those were knowledge and information sharing practices, social and communal practices, meaning and storytelling practices, and advocacy and activism practices. The first category was using social media for information and knowledge sharing. In the dissertation, I talk about how not everyone is capable of the same amount of labor. So without collective action, the most marginalized people with endometriosis can get left behind and left without care. And social media can provide some useful centralized resources and a living archive for this information. Of course, it's not accessible to everyone. My survey results were overwhelmingly positive about using social media for knowledge sharing. 92% of respondents said that it had taught them something new about endometriosis, and 95% said that they found social media helpful or somewhat helpful in managing or living with the disease, which, to be honest, was better than I expected. The second category of things that people use social media for was socializing and community. Despite this commonly being the area where many practitioners are more comfortable recommending social media to their patients, this is actually the least popular of all the survey responses. 63.4% of survey respondents said that they use social media spaces to feel less isolated with the disease. 64.4 used it to offer support, while 54.6 used it to receive support. And my research and my time just existing on the internet showed me that social media can be very conflictual, overwhelming, and difficult. But that despite this, people are willing to navigate those complexities in order to get care and answers. And I spoke to many people who had made like lifelong connections through social media that like live on beyond their time there. The third and final category I identified was using social media for storytelling and awareness raising purposes. The use of social media over the last 15 years has made endometriosis much more visible, meaning both more opportunities for misinformation, but also amazing campaigns by patients to change the narrative around the disease and represent it in its full complexities. The social media posts by people with endometriosis have helped shift the narrative away from a career woman's disease towards recognizing endometriosis as a full body inflammatory condition that affects people of all genders, all races, and all classes. And I've seen this shift reflected in the research recently, which I would say is in large thanks part to online advocacy, as well as other advocacy efforts. The ways endometriosis is negotiated, represented, and researched online create and recreate what endometriosis comes to mean to people, and even how it can come to be treated. As Sarah Ahmed writes in her book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, the very words we use to tell the story of our pain also work to reshape our bodies, creating new impressions. Which is kind of just pain science. We see this in online endometriosis communities where people represent and define their own experiences with the disease in a variety of ways, with selfies or art or humor or memes or whatever it might be. And in doing so, they reshape how it gets seen in the cultural imaginary and how that might actually change access to care in the future. Often we see this talked about in regards to the negative ways that online spaces can impact people's pain, which is fair, but I think it's important that we don't leave out patients' positive and liberatory experiences either, particularly when we know that patients have been so long erased and dismissed. And that's where I'll end it for today, but happy to talk about all of this in more detail.
Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you for that. I have one immediate question just
Cool.
about the. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good. Now I have PTSD from from when my connection broke. So I'm triple checking all the time. Sorry. Um, I wanted to just ask you about the respondents. Um, I'm interested in geographically. Did you have some sort of limitation where most of your respondents are from? And I'm interested if you did any sort of intersection with age, gender, sexuality. Did you ask people to give this sort of information as well? Does it play a role in your research?
Yeah, good questions. I honestly dropped the ball. This was my first time doing a survey of this size, and I didn't collect demographic data from the survey. Um, I do know that it was limited to English speaking folks, and that like the folks that I interviewed came from like a variety of places, but predominantly like westernized countries, North America, some folks in Europe, um, and otherwise, yeah. I do know from like the responses that I got from the survey that there were a number of people who identify as like genderqueer, non-binary, or trans. Um, and yeah, that's about it actually. That I remember right now.
Okay.
Did you do your
Um,
demographics, people?
good tip. And yeah, so it is a shame. Obviously, we would have gotten a little bit more information from that, but you can always be a little bit sly and argue, well, that's actually a pretty good representation of the internet. We don't know who exactly we're talking to. And as I said in the beginning, this did not seem to hinder the popularity of your research, which is being referred very widely and cited all over the place. I hope you are enjoying your moment of fame. And we'll get back to that. Let me just check my notes. Yes, you also said that you mentioned, I didn't write down, but that you mentioned a thing that surprised you in the survey. So that inspired me to ask you, what is something that surprised you the most during your research? Is there something that really struck you as I really did not see this coming at all, and that you then had to sort of tackle either methodologically or theoretically?
Yeah, good question. I think I was like I said, like so surprised by how many people benefited from knowledge sharing, and also surprised that like the social side was a little less popular because a lot of people talked about like how validating it can be to share their stories, but the focus was almost more on like having a platform to tell their stories and less on like connecting with other people. I think because there is so much conflict in the world, and that is like represented again on social media and really reflected there. So it was interesting to like ride those waves as my research went on. Like different conflicts arise that I would sort of witness. I would see people like bickering, and there was like some conflict between some of the people I interviewed. And I think that's like so much a part of the space. But despite that, it is still seen as like such a valuable source of knowledge, like almost as something that like can't be replaced. And I think part of that is like, yeah, you can go to a website for information, but there's something really different about being able to talk to people and like ask their experiences and what they've done, and like get a bit of like a crowdsourced reflection on next steps and on information that is like hard to replicate elsewhere.
That's very interesting. And I guess you highlighted here two things which other types of research have also shown us, like in psychology as well. You mentioned yourself that isolation, feeling isolated is a very big thing where we kind of um, where people try to or actually achieve feeling more part of a community by joining these online spaces. But it's interesting what you said that the ability to tell your story seemed to matter to people more than socializing, let's say, with others. I find that very interesting. And I suppose that we could connect it to the medical gaslighting that you also talked about in the beginning, that we really do feel the need to tell our stories because we don't actually get to tell them that much because of the stigma that you also talked about in the very beginning, but also to just to feel that we are speaking into a space that believes us, right? That's one of the big issues that I think you mentioned. Are there any other conclusions that you've drawn? Have you seen, I guess now I remember, like before we even started the presentation, that we started talking a little bit about these big concepts of medical misogyny and gaslighting. Did you see that reflected, or better put, how did you see that reflected in some of these data?
Yeah, absolutely. It was everywhere. And I guess that's something that also is, it's like both a surprise and not a surprise. I think, especially doing the interviews, was really intense because, like, in a valuable way, but like intense because everyone has such a devastating story, and there are so many similarities between that story. Like, um, a big thing for me was when I woke up from my first diagnostic surgery, the first thing I asked was like, did they find endometriosis? Because you so badly want that validation or that name to put to like the experiences that you have. And that exact story is something that so many people repeated. So there were a lot of those like repetitions. Like so many people had waited. We know like the worldwide average is 7.5 years before diagnosis or something like that. But like so many people had stories of waiting so much longer. So many people had been diagnosed with IBS at some point. Um, so many people had like shared the same kinds of dismissal, or like the go have a glass of wine to relax before sex. Like there are these like common refrains that everyone has lived. Um, and that's brutal. And I think like we talked about that value of telling your story. Like so many people feel invisible and they don't even have the chance to tell their story in a doctor's office because there's not the time for that, or the doctors aren't able to listen for whatever reason, or aren't willing to listen, or they come in with their own bias and stigma. Um, but just like having the opportunity to share that lived experience is kind of irreplaceable, I think. Like that's what so many people need. And I think I do often wonder, like, in my case, like the symptoms of endometriosis are horrible, but the mistreatment made it so much worse. And the mistreatment is what like caused the most trauma. Like, yeah, it sucks to live with endometriosis, but it wouldn't suck nearly as much if you were getting taken care of, even if there wasn't like a cure. But, you know?
Fortunately, this is something that has really been echoed a lot by other people, as you said yourself, on social media. We can see that, but not just on social media, like research from psychology, from other branches of social sciences has really shown that this is something that we see again and again. But it is so very interesting. What's interesting about your research is that these things that we have learned through other types of questionnaires, surveys, speaking with patients, so that other types of researchers have conducted, then we see that people who are not researchers, who have, most of them have not really read these papers, or it's like, why would they? Although a lot of endometriosis patients become experts, we're not obliged to, but they are still writing the same sort of experiences, and we have endo online communities coming to the same conclusions that researchers have come to. And I think that your research really highlights that we see sort of a mirror on social media on mirroring what is actually happening in research. And what I'm interested in, especially with this whole series, is what can we do to apply all this? Where do we apply it and how do we apply it? Because my main question here is, so you were also with me a part of the SEAM network, so social sciences and endometriosis research. We know that this is growing now. We have more researchers in social sciences and in humanities, uh, but we seem to not be able to connect with the medical field to the extent that we want to. So what would you, this is like um, what do you think personally, in which way could doctors use, for example, a study like yours? What would you ideally want them to learn from this, and how can this affect their practice?
Great question. There was like a slide I took out of this presentation that was sort of about this, of this picture of me at this conference where I was on a panel with doctors, which happens very rarely, I think, that like the social science and the patients and like there was patients, there was social science folks, there was physios, and there was doctors all on one panel. But I was talking about like genuinely this stuff, and I was interrupted by the doctor, and I was like, this is such a like reflection of what we're talking about. It's so I think there is a lot of work to be done from multiple perspectives. I think we need more like medical humanities sort of work throughout like the training of doctors. Um, we need to move more towards patient-centered care, where patients can be at the center, where they can have a voice in their treatment. And I think all of this is really, really difficult to do in the systems that we have for healthcare because they're so optimized towards like speed and efficiency and affordability that there isn't a lot of time in doctor's appointments. So like one major factor of this is like healthcare reform overall. But if we scope it down, we need to have these conversations between doctors and social science folks, and we need doctors to recognize that like while they are experts in their field, the patient is always an expert in their own experience, and that always needs to have a say. It always needs to be acknowledged. Even if someone's coming into an appointment with misinformation, it's really important to see like where they're coming from, why they got there, because that's the story. That's the thing that you're going to want to work through. Like they're going online and they're finding misinformation because they're so dismissed and because they're so lost. So all of that is important information. I take a lot of pride in the fact that my study has forced doctors and researchers to acknowledge that social media has value before they go on to dismiss it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they've stopped dismissing it, but they at least have to like cite that study. Um, and I think like it's really hard also for patients to have the same level of authority and power and voice because we're sick. Doing like this research by myself while I was sick, without the same resources that are on like the medical side is really difficult. Like you don't have the funding to do the same scope research. You don't have the energy. So it's really important that those initiatives get funding and care. I would love to see less funding being funneled into certain aspects of endometriosis care and instead going towards like patient-led enterprises. But those are just some thoughts based on what you asked. It's a great question.
You've tapped into something really big there. And patient-centered care is something that we're all hoping that will become the norm and not the exception. And you really reminded me there of a quote by Abby Norman. I'm going to paraphrase it. Abby Norman, who wrote Ask Me About My Uterus. For those of you who haven't read it, it's really a brilliant memoir. And she was also very influenced by social media and the internet in general. It really formed her journey and actually her whole career. And she addressed the same thing as you did about the research, where she said something in the lines of when a patient arrives at a doctor's office with a full folder of research that they've done on their own online, things that they've Googled, social media posts, whatever information they could find, that even if the information, as you said, is not entirely correct, the information that the doctor should take out of this is the seriousness of the illness, because you don't end up with a folder of 100 plus pages of your own online research unless your pain really is that bad, unless you really are that desperate for answers. So, if nothing else, this should be a clue not to dismiss people, but to actually take them seriously. And that really stuck with me, like that thought of hers. And I feel that you've echoed that as well. And
Yeah, absolutely.
speaking of doctors, I'm quoting your research. I also saw very recently a new study on social media by Dr. Matthew Leonardi from Canada, and that you were cited there as well. And I always get so excited when I, when I see people citing you. And interestingly, like in the beginning, when we were just chatting, we also mentioned a little bit the way that doctors would look at this research that we do on Google or on social media as a negative thing. I'm wondering if you feel that that is slowly changing, because what we're seeing now, and if I'm not mistaken, you published a study in 2022, so a few things have happened since then, you know, as well as I do, that the internet is a very fast-paced place. But now we're seeing actually surgeons and doctors making social media profiles, which kind of echo the style of the patients, right? The kind of information they are patient facing. There are big names, especially from the US, like Dr. Setkin, who is very famous, and Cameron Neshat. They're really big on social media now. What are your thoughts on this change? And we can be a little bit, we can be very optimistic about it, or we can be a bit cynical and think that it's just marketing purposes, especially in the US, where you usually pay out of pocket for these specialists. But what are your thoughts on this development?
Yeah, good question. Um I think it's complex. Like I think it's there's a part of me that's very I think it's very important for practitioners to also be in these spaces so that they can share um, real information and clear up misconceptions. Like there are a number of just like outside of this, like endometriosis specifically, there are a number of YouTubers, YouTube sort of doctors that I do really admire. Like Dr. Mike is very famous, or there's Violin MD, like folks who are really just sharing information that are making stuff accessible to people that are like using like fun, silly reaction videos to share medical information. Like I think that stuff is really great. That's the part of the internet that I think can be so beneficial is access to these things and um, in ways that like weren't possible before. But like, yes, also, as much as it can be used for good, it can also be used for negative reasons. The more and more social media goes on, the more like it gets tied into capitalism. And so like there is absolutely people advertising. There's lots of folks who take advantage of people. Doctors, not just doctors, also like homeopathic practitioners and things. Um, I think it's like a bit of a minefield for patients to navigate. It asks a lot of patients to really like it takes a lot of work to deduce all of these things. Like part of the reason I did a PhD was so that I had the time to spend on like learning everything I could about endometriosis. And that's not something that like the average person can do or has the means to do or has the energy to do. Um, and so I think it's really easy for folks to take advantage of people on social media. And there is unfortunately like a lot of pipelines towards just spending a lot of money on things that aren't beneficial. I'm not necessarily like just calling out doctors here. I think this is something that like a lot of people take advantage of. Um, I think anytime a doctor sort of becomes like a cult of personality too, it's complex because maybe they have something really valuable to offer, but you're also becoming a bit of like a figure and there's power and other things intertwined with that. There's also like a very bad habit of doctors to take up the language and um, style of content that people with endometriosis have been making for a long time. And this is sort of just how social media works, but like it sucks that those things go often without acknowledgement of the efforts that people have put in. Like, and it becomes sort of something that is credited to a doctor because they are more powerful, and the labor of folks with endometriosis disappears over time.
Yeah, I really like the fact that you used the term labor as well, because that is something that I've actually been thinking about a lot recently. That once again, it's a lot of unpaid labor, isn't it? And labor that's being put on patients. There are some truly amazing, I'm mostly present on Instagram, so I can refer to that the most. Truly amazing Instagram profiles uh, by people who now go by endo influencers, if we can call them that way, which have so much information, such well-researched information with references towards medical literature. Um, but then you realize, at the end of the day, this is again patient labor, and most of these people, if not all, have done this huge amount of research for free for the same reasons that you've just talked about with your PhD, because they simply needed information and one was offering that to them. And they're reproducing this knowledge, and creating social media content is also a lot of work, and it's time consuming, not to mention the marketing and visibility. And then, as you said, when medical professionals or other types of professionals, we're kind of the hate train towards medical professionals now, but people who are paid for that, who are advertising their businesses, right? They get paid then for, I don't want to say copying, but imitating, let's say, the concepts that were created by patients who, once again, are doing a lot of invisible and free labor. So that gets quite complicated. And I think you really looked at it from a lot of angles and addressed like complexities of online spaces. I suppose in an ideal world, we would figure out a way to make this equitable and to have everyone compensated for their work. But also interestingly, and what I talked about with Jody last time as well, and that you've kind of unlocked here by telling us the motivation for your PhD, is that this happens so often, which is again so revealing of the whole situation, that people end up doing PhDs somehow relating to endometriosis because their patients are looking for answers. And I personally, in all of my networking, know exactly three people who are researching endometriosis who do not have endometriosis, which is an awfully low number. Um, do you have any thoughts on what can we do or what should happen for endometriosis to become a bit more attractive to people who don't have it, or if I may use the word able-bodied people and people who are not sick, who don't have this chronic condition to want to research it more because we're just as end, like how much more work we're doing everything, right? We're organizing ourselves, we're doing freaking PhDs to try and figure this out. How do we get other people on board?
Oh
I mean, it's
man.
a huge question, but do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. I I don't know. I mean, one thing that I've seen like that has shifted over the last 10 years, like in the time from before I started my PhD to now, um, is that when I do workshops with folks and I ask a room of people, like, do you know what endometriosis is? Now, way more people raise their hand. And I will credit, I think a lot of this is like due to social media and people talking about this. So I don't know if that directly leads to like people doing research on a condition, but I do think that like the more we do advocacy and awareness raising, that can only go so far, but like hopefully that also builds a practice of people who are interested in learning about it and researching it. And like I think it is really important that like nothing about us without us, that like endometriosis patients are centered and that they have a say. But you're right, we also don't want to be doing all of the labor ourselves. So it's an interesting balance there. Um, that's all I got.
Well, it's a big question. We can't solve it, at least not right here, right now. But we can inspire people to think about it a bit. And but I appreciate the enthusiasm, and I do tend to be optimistic myself that all of this visibility will hopefully lead to change. It was a much easier thing to ignore when it was just shrouded in silence, right? Now it's being spoken about much more. And I, for one, am always arguing that we should never underestimate pop culture or social
No,
media. And the more that it's present, the more that it's mentioned, even in passing, in novels, in TV shows, in commercials, the higher the likelihood that things will change.
yeah, yeah, and it's been really cool to see it in shows and like movies and books and stuff. Like that's something that feels new and fresh, and sometimes they get it wrong, but sometimes they get it right. So that's cool.
Yeah, I agree. I also get ridiculously giddy when someone just mentions it. It's as if they mentioned me by name.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
a random scene in a show. Someone just mentions Endo. I'm like, oh my God, amazing. Well, this is a very nice positive note to finish on. But before we do, I just want to give you an opportunity. You mentioned that you're writing a book, and you've also told me about writing poetry and essays. If there is some creative work of yours that we can follow or that we can be looking forward to, maybe have some links that you would want to put into chat to share with us.
Yeah, so I have been writing um, a book that's sort of poetry, prose poetry, and a lyric essay um, called Chronically Online. That is about being chronically online and growing up on the internet and a number of things. But one of those things is, again, this topic of endometriosis and social media. Um, and so I'm getting very close to finishing that project. If you follow me um, on Instagram at deranged poetess, that's a good way to keep up to date with that stuff. And yeah, um, I have a Substack, but I haven't been posting there much. You can also follow the Substack.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us and to for this lovely presentation. I really recommend the paper to anyone who hasn't read it yet. I've posted the link earlier in this chat. I'm going to stop recording now, mostly for privacy reasons. If someone